I first had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Tourney in the fall of 2007, and at that time I was a returning student, and Dr. Tourney had only been at BYU for about a year. Before that, he spent much of his career at Western Illinois University, at the University of Tulsa, and at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And I don't know if it was because he had spent so much time at state schools or if he felt special inspiration for my class, but I remember at the beginning of that semester that he made a point of saying to us that he felt like he was supposed to be here at BYU and that he felt that we were supposed to be in his class too. So the rest of the semester, I took that to heart, and I really appreciated Dr. Tourney's attentiveness and generosity in his feedback and the way that he encouraged each one of us. And I really do believe that he is supposed to be here and that the students that get to learn from him are privileged to do so. He is a gifted writer. He's very versatile. He has a very broad range, and I'm excited to hear what he's going to read today. He also has a very sharp eye as an editor, and for aspiring writing students, he provides us with the type of feedback that we can apply toward a career. I just want to share one other story about when I took that class from Dr. Tourney in 2007. He makes it a point to interview his students at the beginning of the semester and to conference with them to get to know them. And I had been, like I said, a returning student, and I had worked for several years, and he asked me about my writing goals. I told him that I had lots of projects that I hadn't finished, and in the perfect world, I would pursue writing more seriously. And I remember at that time that Dr. Tourney made a point of telling me that I should shoot for the perfect world before I settle for the real world, which I think for any writer is very encouraging advice. So it's my privilege today to welcome Dr. Tourney, and I encourage you to listen wholeheartedly to what he has to say.
Thank you, Erin. That was a nice introduction. Probably more than I deserved, but I'll take it anyway. I'm going to be reading this afternoon from two novels. Neither one of them is finished. And by that I mean they're not rough drafts, but I mean they've not been sent off to be published or to my agent. And so nothing that I'm going to be reading today is set in stone, but they do represent current work. One of them is a historical novel. The action takes place in the early 1590s in England. The other one is a contemporary novel. Its action takes place in Australia, probably in 2007 and 2008 and 2009. Both of them are first-person narratives. One represents itself as a long letter. The other is a journal of the main character's year in Australia. One of the narrators is William Shakespeare. At the age of about 20. The other one is a young girl. She's 17 years old. She's from Southern California. She's living in Australia for the year with her father. Her parents recently have been divorced. The disparity between these two works and the fact that I'm working on both of them at the same time, which I don't represent to you as a cause of congratulation, maybe it's sympathy. I'll be available at the outside here to accept your sympathy for that. The fact that I am working on both of these at the same time and that the central characters are so markedly different has made me think a lot this year and last year about voice. Over the years, I've heard it said by a variety of persons, editors, agents, writing workshop gurus, teachers, and just a lot of ordinary, everyday writers and readers, that the dominant feature of any literary work is its voice, or something they call voice. As a teacher and a practicing writer, I've never joined that chorus of approval, largely because I was never exactly sure what the exponents of voice as a dominant quality were talking about. Some seem to be equating voice with style. Others seem to be defining it as the point of view of the narrative. Yet others appear to understand that voice was that which the novel or story advocated, like a voice for environmentalism or women's liberation or some other social or political movement. That is, voice had to do with content, not style, with attitude, not persona. Sometimes voice seemed to have no definition at all. It was simply an undefined and perhaps undefinable possible quality, the sine qua non of good literature, that without which the story or novel just didn't get off the ground. I mean, if you liked the book, you said it had a great voice. If you didn't like it, well, the voice just wasn't there, or it was the wrong voice, or it was the bad voice. In an odd way, it reminds me of what a very good friend of mine, who'd spent many years as an editor in New York for a major publishing house, used to say in his rejection letters to aspiring authors. You have to realize, of course, that editors in positions like that spend a lot of time writing rejection letters. He used to write these letters, and in them he would explain his dislike or his rejection with the phrase, "poor early development." He told me that every rejection letter he ever sent out, in every rejection letter he ever sent out, he used that phrase to explain why the book failed. You see, it was a fancy way of explaining a good response. Maybe a great voice in writing is something like that, a useful, artfully indefinite label for something that in the book that deeply engages us and makes us want to read more. Before letting it go with that, I'd like to share some thoughts I've been having about voice, and this is the larger context of my reading. I had an interesting experience 4 or 5 years ago. I had sent one of my novels around. It had been out looking for a new publisher for about 2.5 years. I just about decided that it was a no-go. It was to be the 9th novel in a series that I started writing in 1980, publishing in 1980, and I had continued to write up until 1994. This was to be the 9th book in that series. Like all of my earlier books, it was written in third person. It had a tight third-person restricted point of view. It was a narrative method that I particularly liked and I felt comfortable with. One day, I got a phone call from my agent. She told me that she'd found an editor who was interested in the book. He really liked it. He wanted to talk to me about it. She didn't say he wanted to publish it, but I was encouraged by this. And subsequently, I had a conversation with him. He said, "You know, I really liked your book. I just loved it. Loved every page of it. Every author loves to hear this. There's just one thing I'd like you to do." I said, "What's that?" Eager to comply. He said, "I'd like you to, you've got Shakespeare in this novel. He's one of the secondary characters. I'd like you to rewrite it and make him the central character. Write the book in his voice." I thought about this for a minute. I was shocked. We're not talking about a revision here. We're talking about a whole new book. Those of you who are writers can well understand this. It means, among other things, a lot of new chapters and a lot of old chapters just go away. It meant that I had to write in the first person, a form I'd never written in. In fact, I was so convinced I was incapable of writing in the first person as a fiction writer. that in my classes I used to advance the theory, which I have now discarded, that humankind was basically divided into two types. Those who wrote in the third person and those who wrote in the first person. And I had pretty much decided that I was the kind that wrote in the first person. See, it's all a matter of genes. Somewhere in the DNA, there's something that explains this. It's a powerful inducement to change when an editor says, I'll publish your book if you do this. Powerful, and I couldn't resist it. It wasn't just that I wanted and needed the money. I always want and need the money. But I have to admit that I found it very challenging. I think if I'm a real writer, one of the reasons I'm a real writer is that I'll take on just about anything. Oh, I might experience a momentary hesitation, a loss of confidence, but the prospect of doing something different and new is so exciting to me. The prospect of the fun of it, I just can't resist it. And so I undertook to rewrite this book, and I did, and I'll make this story, part of the story, mercifully short. One day I was standing in the shower thinking about this project, and suddenly I heard a voice. It wasn't a divine revelation, it was something in my head. And what I heard was the first sentence of the novel, the first utterance of Will Shakespeare, the narrator. Over the next year, I rewrote the novel according to the specifications given me by the agent. And a lot of things were new and a lot of things changed. But one thing that never changed was that first sentence. Once I heard the voice of that first sentence, it was like a key, and it opened up to all the rest. You see, I think in some ways, what we write, the voice of what we write, and I'm going to be moving, I hope, toward a definition of voice. What we write is not just the sentences that we write, are not just bundles of information. They also convey the culture of the speaker, both the personal culture and the larger context of that person's life. Whenever I read the Book of Mormon and I hear Nephi talk about how he learned the language of his father, I always think of language in that sense, with that infinite capacity to convey not just information, but to convey the totality of what we are and what we feel and what we think. Language is an immense code with these infinite capacities to communicate information. And so in that single sentence, suddenly Shakespeare, at least my Shakespeare, came alive for me. And I do not recall any other place in that novel ever stopping and thinking for a moment, what would Shakespeare say now? Anyway, the novel I'm going to read for you today, or the part of it, is from a sequel to that book. That book was published in 2004. It was called Time's Fool. This is actually a sequel. This is actually the third book in what I hope is that series. The second book is with my agent going around looking for a new publisher. When you open the pages of this book, the first thing you see is something entitled Epistle Dedicatory. And even the antiquated inversion there suggests that we are no longer in Kansas. To the most high and mighty sovereign Elizabeth, Queen of England, Ireland, and France, defender of the faith, etc. Honored beyond measure and any true deserving was I, gracious sovereign, when you told me of the pleasure you took in my humble efforts as a maker of plays, and more particularly in my historical works of your noble predecessors and their famous victories. Yet more still in your delight in commendation of my Sir John Falstaff, of whom you have requested that I resurrect him ingloriously to serve a part, in my play of Windsor's Merry Wives, and relate by what happy circumstance I ever conceived of such a person. It was not by chance, nor was it the fruit of industrious contemplation or design. Such means have indeed accounted for the birth of many of my characters, yet not he. Falstaff rather was molded from flesh and blood, as were some of his companions of whom I have writ, namely Poins and Bardolph, Pistol and Nym, Septimus, Gadshill, and the excellent Mistress Quickly. These I have altered somewhat from what they were to make them what they might have been, both better and worse. A poet's license, you may call it. Yet beneath all is a substratum of truth. You have my oath upon it. What follows here then is in compliance with that request, both that your curiosity might be satisfied and that you and others who read these pages may be assured that the Falstaff of my imagining was not that worthy martyr Sir John Oldcastle. Oldcastle being the name the character bore in an earlier iteration of the personage, but quite another, the name being the only commonality betwixt them. For never was it intention of mine to besmirch the reputation of one who with so great courage defied the terrors of Papist domination to defend the pure faith of that church of whom you are the head and defender. Truth was, and is, that the Falstaff of my imagining was grounded in a person I knew as a young man, shortly before I arrived in London to begin my career, such as it is, as player and playwright. His family name was indeed Falstaff, his family seat in Oxfordshire, which family is now decayed, as is the manor itself, since torn down that its timber and brick might be employed in the construction of a finer house in the same neighborhood. With none in these recent years alive to take exception or offense, as was the case only a few years before, I am now free to relate all, and most especially to you, dread sovereign, whose wish must be the command of any subject worthy of the name. And whilst I disclose this personal association with the man Falstaff, I will faithfully relate as well what I knew of his actual career as knight, libertine, and gentleman of the dark, by which I do mean he played the highwayman out of both need and impulse, and give the true particulars of his most mysterious and hideous death, which was not, as I presented in my play of Henry V, lying upon a bed babbling of green fields, but grossly murdered by persons who meant me as much harm as they did him, though their ill intent was frustrated, else would I not be writing this now. I know Falstaff might have wished such a peaceful death as I have wrote of before, surrounded by his friends and drifting off into eternal sleep. Yet God is unwilling to grant to one who took his command so lightly easy dismissal from this world. That allowed, let me not judge a man whom in the brief tenure of our acquaintance I learned not to loathe for his sins, but esteem for his good nature, his generosity, and his love of life, for never had I seen a man drink so deeply of the well of mortal happiness as did this Sir John Falstaff. I will also relate how I came to become a player, and how that resolve grew out of my desperate attempt to save myself when I and my erstwhile companions were abducted by this same Falstaff and held close prisoner in his house, as well as all I witnessed there and never yet disclosed to another soul but to you now. So, gracious sovereign, may the true history that follows give unto your majesty as much pleasure as Falstaff's antics upon the stage, as well as serve as moral instruction as to the fate awaiting those who mock God in their licentiousness and dismiss as naught your righteous laws. William Shakespeare, London. Now I want to comment on the voice of this. This is the introduction, and it sets up the plot to the book. An episode from Shakespeare's early life, some of it factual, more of it pure and unadulterated fiction. And that's fine. That's what historical novels are about. If voice has any meaning, it means that the language has the capacity to convey or project an embodiment of the person speaking. And I think very often when we say we like the voice or we find a voice engaging, what we are really saying is we find the person conveyed by the voice engaging. And when we think about that, it's not awfully surprising. A lot of us love language, but none of us loves anything more than we love other people. There's nothing for us humans more intriguing than each other. In this particular passage, which I represent as Shakespeare, or at least one of his voices, this is the formal voice. I call your attention to some of the qualities conveyed. The first, I think, is this enormous gravity, gravitas. If there's a cultural code communicated here, it's the high seriousness of the writer's task. If there's a social code communicated here, it is the somewhat complicated relationship between the poet who writes and the queen who reads. We all know what kind of a queen Elizabeth was. We all know what a cult was effectively created in her country about her reputation, about her personage. And I think that's communicated here. This is language, too, that's a very self-conscious kind of language. It's almost as if the poet, the writer as he writes, is listening to himself, observing himself. It's a self-conscious kind of writing. And that's part of the voice that you hear in this passage. Later in the book, of course, Shakespeare still speaking, a different kind of voice emerges. It's the same person, but now the voice is less formal, less self-conscious, less grave, and more immediate. The purposes of fiction are not character representation, but story. Later in the book, and this is a story about Shakespeare's abduction as a young man on his way to London, an episode that up until now scholars have been unaware of until they read this book, find out what really happened. He's held prisoner of a sort in Falstaff's house for about 2 weeks. During that time, he is subjected to a number of very pleasant indignities. They're pleasant to us, not so pleasant to him. Indignities, one of which is that he's put to work as a gardener. Falstaff's house is a ruin. He uses it as a base for his various nefarious adventures. When he comes back home, he lives there in semi-squalor. Anyway, this is a chapter called The Horror of the Midden. Midden heap is a place where you put trash. The handsaw did me yeoman service. I cut the strong vines and then pulled them from where they clung to the mottled brick, freeing the door from its leafy verdure and many of the windows. Whilst I did so, the lines of my poems ran through my head and gave me some assurance that though I had been put to hard labor, still my mind was a poet's mind. For a man's acts may be dictated by another, but his mind is a house to furnish as he wills. Thus it was I could destroy but create at the same instant, and realizing that truth, I set about to compose a new poem, a sonnet in which I used the very imagery of the rapacious ivy. I did this work with a will now, for it seemed that every branch I freed from the wall gave me some greater hope that I might work my freedom, if I could only find the proper course. Thomas Whitlock, this is a man who's lived in the house and who has since disappeared. He was an earlier prisoner of Falstaff. Thomas Whitlock had evidently failed, if Poins's veiled tale was to be credited, but perhaps his failure lay in a poor method, one without an iota of hope in it. I was sure I could find my way through the woods and back to the main road. Perhaps I thought I might set fire to the house, poison the dogs, or somehow distract them to the other side of the house whilst I fled to safety, or somehow disguise myself, and yet I knew that would hardly succeed, since at Old Castle all strangers would be suspect. My escape, I knew, must be at night, for during the day I was constantly watched. And as I worked to cut away the vines, I saw from time to time Poyne's long face at the window watching me, and at last once that of Septimus Gadshill peering out at me with that malice the cause of which I now understood, but for which I had no sympathy, since it was my father's act and not my own that stirred him up. Shortly thereafter, my poetic composition done, and I reciting it to myself to make smooth its meter, Poynes came out of doors again to inspect my work firsthand. He stood for a moment surveying it without speech, as though it were some artisan's work he appraised and not a simple job of demolition any simpleton might have accomplished. Then he said, "Well then, Master Shakespeare, you've done much here." There was a tone of surprise in his voice, as though he expected my efforts to prove otherwise. Perhaps some disappointment, too, that he would not have occasion to complain of me to his master. "Sir John will be pleased with his new gardener." I thought to myself, pray God his pleasure is short-lived, for he shall not have my service for long. "You can haul these branches behind the house to the midden heap by the stream," he said, nodding toward the huge pile of branches and leaves. "Is there no man to help me?" I asked, looking at the very large pile before me. "Why, Master Shakespeare, I marvel at your apprehension. You, sir, are young and hardy. The task is not beyond your capacity. Convey all of this down where the land falls away and the stream bends. You'll see it beneath the willows, and undoubtedly smell its rankness before." And then Poynes laughed. It was strange laughter, shrill, almost womanish, and enduring his ridicule, I detested the man more than ever, thinking that before I effected my escape, I might do him some injury for his treatment of me. Nay, I did not think to beat him, but rather impose upon him some disgrace whereby he would remember that Will Shakespeare had been kept an unwilling prisoner of Old Castle Hall and been ill-used by its officious butler. I'm going to stop here. I'll tell you only that in the course of his taking trash down to the midden heap, he finds a corpse, which of course shocks him greatly, and which suggests to him that not everyone who visits Old Castle Hall gets out alive. I want to go to Australia for a moment, for a little bit. You know, humility, a famous virtue, is not really a virtue for a writer. If a writer's humble, he takes a look at the prospects for success, finds them improbable, and gives up. If a writer's humble, looks at a big challenge and says, "I'm not worthy." So rather than humility, I always recommend a little daring. I haven't a lot of experience being Will Shakespeare, but I really have to confess to you that I have had less experience being a 17-year-old girl. Somebody might say, "Well, you've had daughters, haven't you?" And that's true. But you know, the thing about a voice is, find this in a minute, is that even if you write in your own voice, it's a construct. You're never really the person that you put down on paper as I, and no character that you ever create is enough yourself, that you don't have to make some kind of daring, imaginative leap. So I'm going to read a part of this. If I can find the first page. And if I can't, I'll begin with the second. The speaker here is 17. Her name is Kat Rogers. I was living with my mom then. Dad had moved into a dumpy apartment in the sleazy part of LA. My dad's kind of dorky. Didn't have any girlfriends, at least not that I knew about. He works for a big mining company. He's some kind of an accountant, although he's high level and has to travel a lot. He explained to me what he did once, but I couldn't follow it, and it didn't sound that very interesting. Anyway, what happened was that he had this opportunity to go to Australia for the year for his company and asked me if I wanted to go with him. All I knew about Australia was Aborigines, kangaroos, and Mel Gibson. And yeah, that stupid movie about Crocodile Dundee. I had seen these pictures of the Opera House in Sydney, so I assumed the country was civilized, since opera is about as civilized as you can get. I knew you could lose a day of your life getting there. That's how far away it was. So when Dad suggested I come live with him and Mom gave the okay, I said, yeah, I'll give it a try. Besides, I needed to get away from Mom and her boyfriends. It was all disgusting. Mom's serial dating, her constant criticism of my friends. My friends? What about hers? My mother's crazy. I started hanging with a pretty rough crowd. I knew a lot of kids who did drugs, and some of them stole stuff to pay for their habits. I didn't join them in drugs or in stealing, but sometimes we got into mischief. Nothing really serious that you'd go to jail for, just school pranks. Some minor vandalism just to keep things exciting, but mostly to distract from the pain at home. I was desperate to go somewhere. And when you're desperate, you'll agree to live with your dad and go to places like Australia. I don't think Mom minded much about my going. I suspect it gave her a little more freedom with the boyfriends. I guess she was making up for lost time, because I remember her knocking Dad for being dull and boring, which he certainly is, and yet who expects your father to be that interesting anyway? Besides, I didn't see that any of his potential replacements were anything to brag about. Some of them weren't bad looking, but none of them had any job that interested me, or lifestyle, or anything. A couple of them seemed more interested in me than in Mom, and that totally creeped me out. I mentioned that to Mom, but she said I was being immature and jealous because I didn't have a steady boyfriend, and I would understand her needs when I got older. Yeah, right. And so after that, I didn't say anything more. I just tried to make my exit before her boyfriends appeared and stay out of the way as much as possible. She hardly noticed. So it was agreed, and that's how I ended up in Broken Hill, New South Wales, the end of the world, living with my dad and wondering what I had done in life to deserve this. At least that's what I thought at first. A couple of things you need to know about me. Call it a self-portrait, but remember, I'm a little biased, although not always in my favor. First off, I'm 17 but look older, or so I've been told. It's partly the way I dress these days and partly the way I do my hair. I wear it long and it's got a lot of natural curl. I have brown eyes, not blue, which you might expect from my hair color. I'm thin but not skinny and not particularly tall. About 5'4", which I guess is about average for girls. I have a heart-shaped face and lips that are full and get chapped easily. I wish they weren't so full, my lips. I mean, I don't want people to think I've had them injected with chemicals, which I think is really disgusting, especially when you're a young girl. If you're middle-aged, like 30 or something, that's a different story. If you don't like the way you look at that age or older, then I say, go for it, babe. It's your face, it's your life. I'm not a great reader, although I read all the Harry Potter books and some of the Twilight series. I really can't get into vampires and their issues. And I've read Jane Austen a lot, especially Pride and Prejudice, about 1 million times. During my last year in junior high, I had this really weird crush on Mr. Darcy. Seriously, I wanted to be Elizabeth Bennet, but if I was Elizabeth, I think I would have realized what a neat guy Darcy was right from the get-go and not fooled around for 300 pages before getting a clue. My big thing is movies, especially old ones. I rent videos a lot. Too much, my mom says. My favorite movie is An Officer and a Gentleman with Richard Gere and Deborah Winger. Richard Gere plays this guy at officer candidate school, and Deborah is just this really gorgeous girl who works in a factory and is on the make for some guy to marry her. It's a love story, but not cheesy or trashy. I've watched the movie so many times I know almost all the dialogue, and at the end of the movie, when Richard Gere comes into the factory where Deborah's character is working and carries her out of that place like he's rescuing her from this life of unbearable drudgery, I just want to stand up and cheer with the rest of them. Right on, Paula, you go, girl. Paula, in case you've never seen the movie, is the name of Deborah Winger's character. I don't know, maybe my love of movies is just an escape thing. And if it is, so, I mean, who'd blame me? I'm the girl who had to go all the way to Australia to get away from her crazy mother. I can't say that in looking for a voice for this character, I heard any voices in the shower. I can't say it was modeled on anybody I knew, although over the years I've led lots of conversations, and I realized this year how much time over the year I've spent with people between the ages of 17 and 22. And I remember the voices. I had a conversation with the editor of this book today, and I asked him, I said, you know, I've got to tell you that when you see the draft of this, and by the way, this novel is a novelization, which means that it's a book based on a movie rather than the other way around. I said to him, you know, I have to let you know that Cat Rogers has what I think to be an authentic Southern California dialect. She frequently will say, for example, me and my mom are going to the mall, a construction I'm sure that no one in this audience has ever used. Actually, I know you have. It doesn't represent the downfall of the English language. It's a sort of grammatical variation. It's mostly a generational thing. I confess not using it myself, but I'm always entertained when I hear it, especially from my daughter, the one that's the Phi Beta Kappa and been to Stanford graduate school, and will still say on occasion, me and Megan are going somewhere, Megan being her sister. I said to him, you know, you got to be prepared. I don't know how this is going to fly, for example, when this book's published in Australia, which it probably will be first. He said, no worries, mate. It'll be fine. He said, I'm a believer in the progress of English, and I was greatly relieved by that. The character in the book says at one point, she says, I write like I speak. That may not be your cup of tea, writing-wise. It actually is my cup of tea, and I enjoyed working on the voices, and I have one more thing to say about them before I quit and see if there are any questions out there in the audience. I believe the voice is the embodiment of the persona, that it incorporates style, but does much more. Content also is important. I believe it's possible to look at a passage of writing in first person or even in third person and analyze not only the structure of the sentences, but also the cultural code that the language communicates. I'm not suggesting to you that prior to writing one sit down and figure out what cultural code one wants to communicate. That's too much like that ridiculous essay by Edgar Allan Poe in which he pretends that he developed the Raven out of abstract ideas. I've always thought that was totally bogus. I don't think writers work that way. Narration, fiction writing, I think, is a natural, maybe inevitable extension of our language facility. When we generate sentences in conversation and even in writing, somewhere in the deep subconscious, A grammar machine is operating that allows those sentences to make sense. But we are rarely aware of them, rarely conscious of them. Were we conscious of them, I think we would be rendered inarticulate. I suspect fiction writing, it is for me, and I think probably for most of us, we sit down and we start to write. Just as we sit down or stand up and start to talk. Sometimes when things go wrong, it's helpful to have a diagnosis that allows us to fix things. But in a way, writing is a little bit like driving a car, just as speaking is. You hope you never have to open the hood. You just turn the thing on and it goes. Sometimes when things go wrong, you've got to stop. You've got to find out where the catch is to let the hood up, and you have to figure out what goes wrong. That's what book doctors do. That's what editors do. That's what English teachers do, writing teachers do on a regular basis. So I don't want to suggest to you that I sat down with Will Shakespeare and decided that he was going to have this kind of voice, and it would be grave, and it would be self-conscious, and it would communicate the dignity and the social relationship between him and his queen. Nor did I sit down and imagine I have a 17-year-old girl here. What kind of dialect is appropriate for her? I just wrote a sentence and I heard her voice, and then I was off and running with it. My wife, Judith, read the manuscript the other day, and she called attention to one of the sentences in it where Kat uses a word that she didn't think Kat would use. And I thought about it, and I thought, you know what, Judith, you're right. That's the wrong word. And I fixed that. I'm happy to report. And I think that I'm done.